Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Deneri. My name is Sirish Pulusani. We are discussing the war in Ukraine, but in a broader international context this week. Last week, the International Criminal Court, based out of The Hague in the Netherlands, issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for war crimes. And this is a very specific allegation. It was actually for two different people, for Vladimir Putin and a second Russian official. And I want to talk about this in just the broader context, because first of all, this invasion was an illegal invasion, and most of the world agrees on that, right? War crimes seem to have been committed throughout this entire war. Hospitals have been decimated. Civilian centers have been devastated. Millions of refugees, thousands of casualties. This indictment or arrest warrant is specifically for essentially the abduction of children from Ukraine to Russia. Is that correct, Paul? Can you expand on what exactly the ICC is alleging Putin has done?
Yeah, the International Criminal Court alleges, and I don't think there's too much doubt about the truth of it, but alleges that Russia has been essentially abducting children from Ukraine and taking them to Russia and sort of trying to re-educate them, brainwash them into being Russians.
Mm-hmm. Is that happening on a large scale?
Yeah, and the Russians have been very public about it. There's all kinds of claims, right? They claim that the children are orphans. They claim that Ukrainians and Russians are the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. But there's pretty extensive documentation of this happening, and happening in many cases where the children are not, in fact, orphans.
So essentially, Russia, during the invasion, when they take over a town center or whatever, a civilian area, they're taking the kids from the families of parents or orphans potentially, but also kids from literal families of separating families and taking them back to Russia for re-education.
Yeah, and I don't think it's the case that they're doing it with 100% of the children in occupied areas, but they are doing it with thousands.
Uh-huh.
And so the other person who's been indicted is, I've forgotten her name and her exact position, but she's essentially the sort of minister of children's and family affairs in Russia, because they're the ones who are running these sort of re-education camps. Mm-hmm. When you think about these analogs around the world that were done in, decades past and centuries past, where sort of, Aboriginal children in Australia or First Nations children in Canada or Native Americans in the United States were taken from their families and sent to these, essentially schools that were supposed to, turn them into white people. It's the same kind of thing, except that it's not 1910 and that it's done under a war, which makes it a war crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you brought up in the past wars, has something like this been done on any sort of significant scale?
I don't know of anything like this being done on this scale in war. There may be some examples, though.
Okay, so this is a very serious allegation.
Absolutely.
But the question is coming from the International Criminal Court. Now, as far as I understand it, The Hague could prosecute people. They could hold trials for war crimes. What exactly is their power? You have to be a member of the International Criminal Court. And I think multiple countries, including Germany, have said if Putin comes into their country, they will arrest him. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Russia says we're not parties to what's called the Rome Statute, which was the agreement that formed the International Criminal Court. And I would point out the United States and Russia are both among a fairly small number of countries that are not party to the court, party to the treaty. And so Russia says we're not parties to this treaty, so this is irrelevant to us. The court and international law has always claimed that certain kinds of crimes are crimes, regardless of whether you say that you accept the jurisdiction, and war crimes would fit into that, right? The prosecutions after World War II in Germany and in Japan were basically saying these things were criminals whether you accept this court's jurisdiction or not. Mm-hmm. So for all of the countries in the world, and it's most of the countries in the world who are parties to the Rome Statute, they are obligated by the treaty to arrest him, and that's the significance of the arrest warrant. Now, it's not clear that many of them will arrest them, but it does change the game politically in that respect, as it takes a lot. Think about India. We talked about India a couple of weeks ago. India seems to be on the sort of neutral / pro-Russian side of this war, right? And India has talked a lot about, the bad things the United States has done over the years and international law. If Putin goes to India now, India kind of has to put up or shut up, right? They either have to arrest him or they have to stop, right, saying that they're all about international law, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the political change.
That's interesting you brought that up, because I think most of India is actually pro-Russian to some degree in this sense because of their own self-interest, which is not abnormal to say. But essentially, there's also, I can hear the arguments too, like, well, the United States committed war crimes in Iraq, right? So let's say that claim is made. The United States committed war crimes in Iraq. Yep. What is the responsibility here of the people who actually committed the war crimes versus George W. Bush being the commander-in-chief of the United States military, and the parallels to this, what's happening in Russia?
I'm smiling Ukraine. Because I would love to do a whole episode on that question, on U.S. war crimes in Iraq, and what's the difference? So there's an important difference here. The important difference is the ICC, for whatever reason, didn't indict anybody from the United States, including George Bush. Why not, you might say? Well, that actually gets into the legal arguments. And I've looked into, I'm not an international law specialist, but I did some reading for my own, interest and for that of a course that I teach, sort of what's the case? And the case against the United States that the war itself was illegal, right? The case that the war itself was illegal is strong but not airtight. We could get into that if you want. The question of war crimes in the war, in the conduct of the war itself, there actually have been several American soldiers, more than a few, right, have been indicted and actually gone to prison or sustained other penalties like being stripped of rank and kicked out of the army for war crimes. So at this point, now without getting too academic, we need to distinguish between war crimes and crimes against humanity, because Putin's actually charged with crimes against humanity. Mm-hmm. War crimes are kind of they're single instances, right? A soldier out in the field somewhere executes a prisoner of war, right? That's a war crime.
That happens in every war. This happens in every single war. War crimes take place.
Soldiers. There's never been a war in which war crimes. You occupy some area and soldiers rape women. Soldiers, right? They do terrible things. Those are all war crimes, and they're all violations of international law. But typically, right, those are crimes committed by people in the battlefield. Things rise to the level of crimes against humanity when it's considered to be systematic and that there's a political decision to have done it. And that's why Putin is being charged. Not because anybody thinks that he went to Ukraine and abducted children, but because he has made it a matter of Russian policy. And it's why the person being indicted along with him is this lieutenant of his who's carrying out the policy.
Yeah, I think that's a major thing to distinguish, right? I mean, you could make the argument, whatever you think about the war in Iraq, and we've talked about this. I think we were both on the same page here, being against it to some degree. But there's still questions about the legality of that war. But on the other hand, war crimes took place, but was it necessarily under the direction of George W. Bush, or was it individual soldiers? Now, at the same time, there were some systemic things, right? Like what happened in Guantanamo, or the pictures that came out, or the torture. What about those things?
Well, so I think, and again, here's where we're going to get a little bit outside my specific knowledge of international law, but that's where it would be really valuable to know, and maybe I'll have to go do some research on this, right? Why were there not international indictments regarding Guantanamo? And I think part of it is, the Bush administration had some very good lawyers, very high-powered lawyers, who were working very hard at finding ways of doing what they wanted to do, right, without violating either U.S. or international law. So briefly, right, one of the reasons why these guys all ended up in Guantanamo in the first place, is that they didn't want to bring them to the United States, where then the American court system could have gotten involved. And so one of the things that people complain about is that we, by sticking them in Guantanamo, we sort of put them in this legal limbo. Because it's a legal limbo, right, it's hard to identify the law to say that this was broken and so on. The other thing I should say is, because the United States actually did prosecute certain people for war crimes, there's sort of this presumption, or at least a belief, right, that the United States was competent in prosecuting war crimes that took place under its war. And so one of the things that the ICC, that its charter basically holds, is that the ICC is not out there to prosecute every war crime that happens, but rather only to get involved when the country who has jurisdiction is either unable or unwilling to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And so in part because the United States does seem to be capable and at least partly willing of prosecuting things, the ICC would basically say we don't have jurisdiction,
mm-hmm.
regardless of whether the United States is a party to the treaty or not.
Yeah.
So the legal arguments get fairly fine, but my best guess is because of the resolutions that were passed because of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1991, the invasion was in 1990. All of those UN resolutions were still operative. None of them were ever reversed or closed out or ended.
Mm-hmm. And
the Bush administration's policy was always, even though it was 12 years later, that because those resolutions were still operative, that they basically allowed the use of force in Iraq. And just as they allowed it in 1991, they allowed it in 2003. Mm-hmm. That's been the argument. I'm guessing if you were to take it to an international jury of scholars, they would probably say, "God damn it, you're right." So you get away on that loophole.
Yeah. No, this is a fascinating thing because you bring up a great point. The Bush administration utilized a team of lawyers, and they consulted with them, and they actually tried to do things by the law and make sure. And they found a lot of loopholes, right? It was actually represented, I think the movie was called Vice with Christian Bale. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
The Dick Cheney movie where he found every loophole possible to essentially take control and execute this war on terror and do it under legal means, per se. But, there's countries who could very much look at that and say that is war crimes. The most the case that maybe that kind of sticks in my mind, and I have very small memories of this, but that was significant, is Slobodan Milosevic, what was tried at The Hague, I think, in the early end of 1999 or something like that. I think he eventually died in prison.
He eventually died in custody. I don't remember exactly when the trial was.
But essentially there was a war, and he was charged for crimes against humanity. Do you remember that?
So Milosevic, and there was another guy called Karadzic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were. Slobodan Milosevic was the president of Yugoslavia and then Serbia. Karadzic was one of the main generals, and they were both. What's interesting about Milosevic's case is he was a head of state, like Putin. He was indicted, like Putin, and for years nothing happened, right? Because they couldn't get their hands on him. The International Criminal Court doesn't have police. They don't have marshals who can go arrest people. For years, nothing happened. But eventually, it became in Serbia's interest to turn him over.
So the Serbian government turned him, gave him to who? Who did they give him to?
Well, they basically took him to The Hague. And this is actually interesting. The Hague, the International Criminal Court, runs trials and runs courts. They don't run prisons. Yeah. Right? So actually they have an agreement with the government of the Netherlands for these folks to be housed in special, basically according to the rules of the court, to be housed in Dutch prisons.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Netherlands itself is actually taking part in the imprisonment of people who are standing trial at The Hague, and The Hague.
That's
is in the
right.
Netherlands. Basically
under the jurisdiction and through a treaty with the court. Yeah.
Okay. Another famous international trial, I think, is the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Did that happen at The Hague?
That did not. That happened in Jerusalem.
That happened in Jerusalem. They actually kidnapped him, took him back to Israel to stand trial at Israel.
Yeah, just to review for people who don't know, Eichmann was the architect of the Nazi final solution, the sort of systematic transportation of the Jews of Europe to concentration camps and killing them en masse. He was found in Argentina by the Israeli Secret Services in the early 1960s.
Was it the Mossad back then, or was that name later on?
I don't even know if that was the name then, but basically it was Mossad.
Yeah.
And they ran this amazing operation to basically grab him in Buenos Aires, fly him back to to Jerusalem, and they put him on trial in Jerusalem and executed him.
Yeah.
The great political theorist Hannah Arendt wrote a famous book about it, in which she coined the phrase, the banality of evil.
Yeah, which meaning go into that phrase because it's a fascinating the banality of evil. This is a guy. What is it? Because he just took orders or something, right?
That was it. It was the bureaucratic nature of what Eichmann did. He was not. I think in this presentation he was not an ideologue. He was not a zealot. It was. I think what struck Arendt was you were looking for this monster, and what you got was a bureaucrat. And I think it was that phrase has resonated throughout the years because of this idea that it doesn't necessarily take monsters to do this stuff. Mm-hmm. It takes normal people just doing their jobs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The ideologue in that situation, obviously, being Hitler, who actually ordered the final solution,
and of course, a lot of other people as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so just kind of wrapping this International Criminal Court, their power. I just want to think about this like a scenario that Putin actually stands trial. Okay, so is there any scenario you could possibly imagine where Putin is standing trial for crimes against humanity?
I think it's exceedingly unlikely, but let me give you a possible scenario. Supposing that democracy comes to Russia, that the Putin regime is overthrown. Those who are overthrowing Putin may not, especially if they want to be democratic, they may not want to kill him, but they certainly wouldn't want him sticking around either. You
don't think a Muammar Gaddafi type situation would happen to Putin?
I think that's one of the things that Putin fears most.
Yeah,
his reaction to what happened to Gaddafi was like really visceral, and I think he does fear that. But depending on what's going on, people might decide that it's better to send him to The Hague. Let me give you a slightly different scenario, which is it's not a democratic revolution in Russia. Maybe there's just sort of some palace coup in Russia saying we want to get rid of this guy. We can't have him coming back. Send him to The Hague. So one could also imagine, and I think this is exceedingly unlikely as well, him miscalculating and going to some country where he thinks they're going to arrest him, or they're not going to arrest him, but they do. There was a famous case right years ago where the former Chilean dictator, Agustin Pinochet, was in Spain, and a Spanish judge basically put out an arrest warrant for him. There was a mix there of Spain, England, and so I don't remember the details, but it was a big international diplomatic incident because he had traveled expecting that he wasn't, liable to be grabbed, and somebody said he should be grabbed.
Yeah.
There was not a sitting indictment for him at that point. The idea was he should be grabbed because he's suspected of committing crimes.
Do you see? Putin, I can't imagine Putin going to any sort of situation that he's going to risk anything like this, right? Like there's no scenario that he's going to be putting himself in this situation.
I think that's right, but again, I could invent all kinds of like movie plots, sort of far-fetched scenarios. But I think the general view is Putin's not headed to The Hague anytime soon. But this was a big diplomatic blow to him and to Russia, because it says that he's not just a bad dude; that he's a war criminal.
Mm-hmm. Is there any authority for member nations to proactively go after him?
I do not believe that that's the case. I'd have to do some looking again, but I don't think it's like we're allowed to go into Russia and grab him now.
Mm-hmm. So
like even more far-fetched than the other scenarios.
That's the movie's scenario, right? You're sending in the special forces into Russia to take Putin out, but that's not going to happen.
No,
that's not going to happen. Well, it's another kind of wrinkle in this entire complex situation that's taking place. It's kind of a good segue, which we're going to talk about, I think, in our next episode, which is going to be, Putin has a lot of enemies in the world now, and it's kind of, you could very well view it as, the West versus Russia, but it's really, really not like that, because Xi Jinping just went to Moscow to meet with Putin, right? So we'll talk about that, Paul. It's fascinating what's happening there. There are sides that are being, taken here, and it's a showdown potentially that's coming up. So we'll continue that conversation. All right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.